Hello, dreamers. Good morning and welcome back to the podcast. I'm taking this Monday morning off from the oil shop in order to record the second part of our series entitled The Tale of the Double Cross, What Happened to Cliff Lambert. I seriously had to force Fred out of the bedroom because he wouldn't stop barking at the trash people, at the landscaping people, at everybody, which my window overlooks and he can hear everything. We're lucky that we don't have to hear it in the recordings, and I feel very fortunate that it is definitely quiet, except with Fred in here. I hope all of you are doing well and had a fun Sunday. I have nothing to do with football anymore ever since I've been separated and divorced. The Super Bowl can just suck it, especially the Miami Dolphins. I left off the last episode with having introduced you to most of the characters in the story, and I was just about to introduce you to the prosecutor in the case, and where she is going to take this long and winding story over the course of the next almost decade. Her life was literally consumed by this case for years. So she isn't exactly free to talk about everything, but she definitely gives us an idea of how when one person is missing or harmed or murdered, it has so many lasting effects on so many people for the rest of their lives. And this is one of them. And as I record this, we're getting on into a week since the mother of today's show host, Savannah Guthrie, had gone missing and has allegedly been kidnapped. It's one of the most confusing and bizarre stories that have come our way in quite some time. I'm waiting on pins and needles for this story to develop. And once there are some definitive answers, we might talk about that in an upcoming episode if you all are interested. I know I don't do these things in real time, and it's just because I take a lot of time to write these episodes, and by the time I actually finish, the stories that are big news as I'm writing kind of fade off into the sunset. Hopefully this one sticks around a little bit and has a happy ending, and I would be glad to report that the mother of Savannah Guthrie, Nancy Guthrie, makes it home safe. Fingers crossed. I know it doesn't feel like it's a good situation because of her advanced age and her frail health. So hope and pray that she makes it back. Anyway, let's get back to our episode here. The double cross, what happened to Cliff Lambert. This is part 2 of 2. So like I said, the next person that's going to be introduced into this convoluted tale is really one of the few females of the bunch that has a main role in the story. And that would be Riverside County Prosecutor Lisa DeMaria. The case is going to consume a tremendous portion of this poor woman's life. And these grifters are really going to put her through it from start to finish. They had this lady's number and they were not going to be stopped. But I don't want to get too far into the weeds with her story. She could actually have an episode of her own, and she actually seems kind of interesting. It would be an interesting person to interview. But she is interviewed on the Dateline episode related to this case, so you can watch or listen to her go through her entire ordeal with all of the dramatics, and she's waving her arms. She's very animated when she talks, so it's entertaining, and just it really gives you an idea of just how all-consuming this case actually was. I mean, it was harrowing, but I'm really more wanting to focus on this group of ne'er-do-wells instead of her. So anyway, it would turn out to be Prosecutor DeMaria who heard the whole story that Tyson Wrench recited. And she did see a lot more similarities between Thomas White's case and Cliff Lambert's case. And as a reminder, Tyson Wrench was the tech entrepreneur who had been ripped off by Kashal Narola and what's his name, Danny Garcia, some years before, and he did his own investigation and got into that whole thing with the gentleman that they allegedly framed for being a child sex abuser and had gathered up all these kids in Mexico who accused him of being inappropriate with them. And so, yeah, that's who Tyson Wrench was, as a reminder. She's the one who kind of saw the parallels between his story and what was going on here in our story today with Cliff Lambert. I mean, of course, the crimes have been executed quite differently, but the idea behind it all is the same. Put these guys on ice, either literally or figuratively or both, and then go and have their way with their assets and their wealth. And the one who was apparently in charge of most of it, if not all of it, was the person connected to both Thomas White and Cliff Lambert, and that common denominator would be Danny Garcia. That was the date that Clifford found when he tried his hand at online dating. Danny had figured out very early on that if he could just find the right, wealthy, rich men to go after, that he would be able to come up with some sort of scheme to get his hands on their money. And he found that the best way to do that early on, at least in his criminal career, was civil lawsuits. So with that, investigators and authorities in Palm Springs narrowed the focus in on Danny Garcia. What the heck was he up to down there in Palm Springs? But along with that, according to the stories that Tyson had shared about the time that he used to party with Danny and Cashul, that established a prior link between the two men, and that there is a possibility that they've linked up once again to carry out yet another con. This time, their target was Cliff, and he was at a very vulnerable time in his life when Danny met him. These types of con men can really kind of pick up on those vulnerabilities pretty quickly, you know. So Danny was the one who connected with Cliff, his latest target. And once that was set in place, he then brought in this so-called Prince of Nepal to help set Cliff up for Danny's next big cash grab. That would be Prince Cashul Narula. And if you haven't figured it out yet, Cashul isn't any sort of prince from Nepal living in exile in California. So he's no more of a prince than Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is a prince, am I right? The prosecutor looked up Cashul's background and found, he has made a criminal career out of grifting. He had made up these outlandish stories about his backstory and his history, and one of them was that he had ties to some multi-million-dollar piece of artwork that was stolen by Nazi soldiers in World War II, and just prior to getting involved in this latest con against Cliff with Danny Garcia, Cashul had recently been charged with a jewelry heist worth more than $300,000. And most of that year that Cliff had vanished in 2008, Cliff had vanished in December, so most of 2008 prior to his disappearance, Cashul had actually been in jail in California on those very charges. So because Cashul was in jail, investigators decided to try and see if they could get their hands on his jailhouse phone call recordings throughout the time that he was incarcerated. And it's probably no surprise that these idiots spoke pretty regularly, and that would be Danny and Cashul. And Danny would be on the outside updating Cashul on the inside regarding the progress that he was making with Cliff. On the Dateline episode, they played some of the recordings between the two of them, and if you haven't watched it, they played pretty much just most of the incriminating stuff, starting with how Danny just found Cliff online and that he's become the target of their next con. He described Cliff as a very prominent person and that he's flying down to Palm Springs, and that the plan at the time was to try and get Cliff to invest in some phony made-up business that Danny would just create in his own imagination, and that they would also try to work their con on the many well-to-do friends that Cliff had there in Palm Springs. So it wasn't just Cliff. Cliff was just the gateway to the Palm Springs social scene. Cliff, for his part, built himself up a lot to Danny. Kind of braggy, you know? I don't know how much of what Cliff said was true or just really super duper exaggerated, But Danny was telling Cashul on those recorded calls that his good friend, and that's Cliff that he's talking about, his dear friend, actually, has this huge mansion in Palm Springs, and he's best friends with a German baroness, and that Cliff's practically BFFs with the Rockefellers. And Cashul is just eating it up. He's like the most excited, incarcerated person I've ever listened to. Anyway, in the recorded call, you can hear Danny Garcia bragging about all of his potential leads, which he's actually talking about Cliff and his friends and his associates. They talked regularly so Danny could give Cashul updates on everything, and it's pretty obvious from the way that they say things that they're scheming. They're talking and Cashul asks him if he's generating resources. And Danny's like, absolutely. And Cashul says, how much? And Danny says, a lot. And then Cashul says, have you already generated it? And Danny says, yep, yes, I have. And they're just planning, all of it recording during the time that Cashul was in jail. And the thing was, the detectives listening in on this conversation really didn't know if Danny was being truthful or if he was exaggerating. They don't know if he actually did generate resources or not, or if it was still in the works or whatever. They just don't know if he's just blowing smoke up Cashul's ass, you know what I mean? But we do know that it wasn't too long after that specific phone call, in putting together a timeline of events, they found out that Cliff had actually kicked Danny out of his house. Cliff walked in on Danny snooping around in his home office. After it happened, Cliff told Eddie about it. And it was something that really upset Cliff. Infuriated is how Cliff was described. It was almost like Cliff couldn't believe it. He welcomed the guy into his home and he had the nerve to snoop through his stuff, especially in his office. Like that was Cliff's private room that nobody had any business going into. He was on his computer, Danny was. Danny was on Cliff's computer, changing his plane ticket that Cliff bought him from economy class to business class. So yeah, Cliff is flying this guy back and forth from San Francisco, and it's just not good enough, right? It never is. And on top of that, a few days later, Cliff called Eddie to tell him that he noticed things had gone missing from his home, and he asked him to come over. So Eddie went over there, and you remember Eddie Mullican was the gentleman who befriended Cliff at a bar where he was dancing at in about 2006, so just a couple of years. Eddie only knew Cliff for approximately 2 years, but they became good friends and they were never romantically involved, just as a reminder. So Eddie went over there and Cliff showed Eddie some empty spaces on his walls where you could tell from the slight discoloration or dust on the wall that something had once been hanging there. Cliff was missing several pieces of artwork that had been hanging in his home. And Eddie and Cliff stood there looking at the spots where the artwork had once been on display. And Eddie said it was like they were stuck in some kind of weird made-for-TV movie. Like, what is actually happening here? Are we in like the Twilight Zone or something? I guess these guys just really had way too much trust in people and never really had a problem until they had this chance encounter online dating with Danny Garcia, someone who's turning out to be quite the con person. So according to Dateline, Cliff made a police report about the theft and indicated that he had been burglarized 3 different times in total. And all of that happened from the time that he started seeing Danny in April, leading up to the time Cliff vanished at the beginning of December. Again, Dateline really got kind of vague about all this, and I don't know how it actually all happened. If Cliff went in 3 different times to file police reports, they didn't say if the police reports had been filed prior to him kicking Danny out. What Josh Mankiewicz said on the Dateline episode was, quote, according to police reports, Cliff claimed to have been burglarized 3 separate times between Danny's visit in April and Cliff's disappearance in December. During their investigation, Detective Browning and Min did not think that those were related. These 2 instances did not appear to be connected at all. And dreamers, I really can't figure out for the life of me what that actually means or how this all went down and in what order. But if I were investigators And, this guy starts dating someone, and then suddenly his home is burglarized 3 times before the homeowner ultimately vanishes. I think those events were absolutely connected, and I'm not sure why investigators didn't think that there was a link. I mean, someone new comes into this guy's life, and suddenly his belongings go missing prior to himself going missing. So for the detectives to kind of sit there and say that they didn't think that there was a connection, and I was reading a transcript of the Dateline episode, but I went back into my Peacock app and I rewatched the part where the 2 detectives said these 2 incidents didn't appear to be connected at all. The next thing he said was, not at the time. And Detective Browning followed up with yeah, there was no forced entry. And, watching these guys back in this episode, it doesn't even look like when they said that statement, like these weren't connected, these events didn't seem connected at the time. It doesn't even feel like that these investigators believe themselves. I honestly just think that they didn't care. There was no sense of urgency to be found with these officers when the missing persons report was filed by Eddie. And I understand that too, because there was so much mystery and confusion surrounding the case that nobody was even sure if there was a crime that took place, and there's just not enough resources to maybe investigate a maybe criminal act. But if they went into the missing persons case armed with the information about these previous home burglaries that happened in less than 8 months, I think the average investigator would look there first. I don't know what they did or didn't do in terms of their investigation as a whole, but I do know that the first detective, it just didn't feel like the case was pressing or urgent. And with Eddie sitting there just trying to keep up the hopes and wanting to remain optimistic by convincing himself that he's overreacting, that nothing's wrong, Cliff's just doing a thing and he'll be back, that probably didn't make the detective feel like there was anything life or death at hand here. So it just sort of had to become an issue over time as more tips came through and evidence started getting looked at a little bit differently through a different lens. But really, having to wait until the people who made Cliff vanish decide to try and put his house on the market, only then were the investigators thinking, it's my phone. Sorry about that. It was my daughter. I had visited her. I want to say I went the weekend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, but then 2 weeks later, she had a dental emergency. So I went back again last weekend. No, the weekend before last. So about 10 days ago. Yeah, to visit. And I'm trying to visit more often, especially when the weather is good. But anyway, sorry about the interruption. I left off with saying how Cliff's friend Eddie was, in terms of his disappearance or what had happened to him, was trying to keep the hopes up high by convincing himself that he was the one that was overreacting, that there was nothing wrong, Cliff was just doing his thing somewhere and that he would be back. And that probably didn't make the detective who got assigned the case feel like that there was anything life or death at hand here. So it just sort of became an issue over time as more tips came through and evidence started getting looked at differently. But really, having to wait until the people who made Cliff vanish decide to try and put his house on the market, only then were the investigators thinking, hey, maybe there's something going on here, finally. I don't want to sit here and Monday morning quarterback these detectives, and yes, I still do NFL references, even though I'm long divorced from the NFL and the Miami Dolphins suck. But as I was saying, I don't like judging how detectives and investigators take a look at their case. But all I do have to say about this is, thankfully, the case eventually started to sink in to a point that everyone had to stop trying to rationalize Cliff's disappearance and take it for what it was, a serious problem. Also, when the detective said that there was no forced entry, that to me would have indicated that it could have been somebody who was intimately involved or had intimate knowledge of Cliff and his home, or had access or allowed himself or herself in. It makes me think that they didn't take Cliff's burglary reports seriously. That maybe if they had taken his previous reports of his home being burglarized a little bit more seriously, and if there was potentially some forced entry, and then what? They may have been able to connect the cases sooner to Cliff's disappearance if there had been forced entry. I just kind of think that they used the fact that there was no forced entry into the burglaries and no forced entry after Cliff's disappearance. That wasn't enough to just be like, okay, well, we'll just wait for him to turn up. I honestly don't really think that the investigators really saw the previous burglary reports. I don't think they really compared the notes on those incidents to Cliff's disappearance. And instead, they just decided that there was nothing connecting any of this to Cliff being missing. I kind of think that they didn't even look at the burglaries much at all until later on, after people started trying to move Cliff out of his own house so they could sell it. Only then did the detectives start taking a serious look at Cliff and where he may have gone. But anyway, there is yet another person that we are going to get to know in this story, but only for this portion of the story. And I don't know, he seems sort of like an irrelevant character in all of this, but he was around. The only reason why he might not be in jail today is because they could never prove that he had knowledge of what was going on. He was there, he was doing things, but did he really know what these other people were up to? I don't know. This is a relative of Danny Garcia who became involved in the story. But ultimately, like I said, he's not in jail and he would never face any charges related to this case. So this guy's involvement has something to do with the burglaries that Cliff thought had taken place in his home. In fact, it was someone that investigators had never even contacted in relation to this case, but rather somebody that Dateline had tracked down and talked to. So I guess you can kind of take this guy's statement with a grain of salt. I'm even debating whether or not to include what this guy had to say, but I will anyway because he's sort of on the periphery of everything. His name is Dennis Domini, and he's Danny Garcia's cousin. Now, this guy, Dennis, I'm watching him on the interview with Josh Mankiewicz on Dateline, and he told Josh Mankiewicz that Danny had the access that they needed to Cliff's house, which is why when things went missing, there was no signs of forced entry into the house. He said that Danny had the codes to the alarm, the codes to the garage, he was able to get in, and he helped himself to Cliff's keys and had his own set made. Danny found everything he needed during one of the many times I'm sure he let himself into Cliff's office. His cousin Dennis was apparently the one who drove Danny around for whatever reason. I guess that was just part of his game. I have this feeling that Danny, he was kind of young when he started getting involved in all of these cons and maybe actually never really learned how to drive. But Danny wants to act like he's got a lot of money and he lives the high life. And part of that included having a driver. Dennis Domini is one of those guys that likes to sit around and brag about being an ex-con and regale you with all of his stories and adventures. And as he sat there and spoke freely about the times that he was arrested and the 2 times that he spent time in prison, bragging that he was an inmate at San Quentin, but for stuff like growing and selling weed, nothing really violent or serious, otherwise the guy wouldn't be free to talk to Josh Mankiewicz on Dateline, right? And in the course of this conversation he's having with Josh, he reminds us that his name Dennis spelled backwards is sinned, and that's the way he's lived his life, blah, blah, blah. The conversation is so stupid and lame. I'm not even going to go through their conversation, but he apparently had some information to share about what happened to Cliff, and he's willing to talk. The time has passed. He was never implicated in anything. And, he was just sitting there in this interview, just kind of casually speaking about his life of crime. When Josh asked him if his experiences in prison scared him straight, Dennis started off his answer by saying, "No, being a sociopath, ... And after that, I just kind of tuned out his noise because he reassured Josh that everything that he was going to say was the absolute hand to God, honest truth after telling Josh that he's a sociopath. So yeah, take it as you will, but he did have a little bit of information and gave us some context around what happened in terms of these burglaries. So according to Dennis, he was the one who would drive Danny down from San Francisco to Palm Springs, and it was then that those burglaries took place at Cliff's house. He said that he would drop Danny off in Palm Springs, he would drive up to Vegas for a few days, and when Danny was ready to go, he would drive back to Palm Springs, pick him up, and they'd go back together to San Francisco. And Danny always had things with him from Cliff's house when they left, but said that they were things that Cliff had gifted him and things like paintings. As for Dennis, he wasn't sure at the time if he believed his cousin or not. He probably was just good to go along for the ride and whatever money Danny was going to pay him for his troubles, So he didn't have like a huge role in everything that happened in those short 8 months that Danny Garcia was plundering Cliff's house. And, it is kind of likely that he didn't know the truth of what was going on. He could have been believing what Danny was telling him and not questioning it. And Danny was keeping the real truth to himself, which is probably a smart thing to do. It's just as easy to believe the story that Danny has a wealthy, older sugar daddy boyfriend as it is to believe that they've befriended Cliff in order to rob him blind. It doesn't seem like Dennis would have cared either way considering his background, but he may have not wanted to have any part in anything criminal if he was trying to stay on the straight and narrow. If Dennis knew Danny was up to no good or not, it's anybody's guess. But I think if Dennis knew the actual truth, he might not have gone along. So Dennis and Danny apparently made a total of 3 trips to Cliff's house in order for Danny to steal artwork literally off the walls of Cliff's own home. Now, I'm assuming Danny came to Palm Springs unbeknownst to Cliff. He would surreptitiously be spirited into town by his quote-unquote driver, and I guess he would just be surveilling Cliff, or he could even be talking to him from his cell phone while Cliff is under the impression that Danny is hundreds of miles away in San Francisco. And Danny would be privy to Cliff's schedule. If he had plans to go out for the night, then Danny knew he had a certain amount of time to be able to let himself into Cliff's house and help himself to anything he wanted. And that was the plan from day one when they got together. As soon as Cliff invited Danny into his home, Danny started keeping those close tabs on where everything was at, where Cliff kept important things. He memorized alarm codes, entry codes, and he was even able to lift Cliff's keys long enough to go and have his own set made. So Danny did these 3 burglaries, and I don't know how long it took Cliff to notice that things were missing each time. If nothing is obviously moved or disturbed, you might not notice right away, especially if the house is big, and Danny described it as a mansion. I want to say it's somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 square feet, so it's a pretty good sized house. He may have made reports each time he noticed things, but didn't actually necessarily know when those things went missing. Danny was able to get away with it 3 times before getting caught snooping in Cliff's private office and subsequently being kicked out of Cliff's house and ultimately Cliff's life. So, to clarify the series of events up to this point, Cliff and Danny met in April of 2008. Cliff started flying Danny out to Palm Springs from San Francisco. During those planned visits, Danny took it upon himself to get a hold of Cliff's alarm codes, his door codes, his set of keys, as those visits that he made were likely Danny doing some kind of reconnaissance, casing the joint, so to speak. In between those planned visits, Danny had his cousin Dennis drive him from San Francisco to Palm Springs, likely during the times that he knew Cliff would be out of the house for an extended period of time. The burglaries happened a total of 3 separate times. 3 times, Danny and Dennis drove down together so Danny could slip into Palm Springs behind Cliff's back, break into his home, take whatever it was that he wanted, and then quietly slipped back out of Palm Springs. And Cliff would be none the wiser. I assume Cliff eventually noticed things missing from his home and made those police reports. The final burglary took place, and I don't know if it was on this third and final trip that Cliff caught Danny in his office, or if Danny came down for a 4th attempt at breaking in and he miscalculated the amount of time that Cliff would be gone, and he may have been on an actual trip to visit Cliff when he was caught snooping through his stuff, since he was upgrading his plane ticket that Cliff had got for him, and he wanted to fly home first class. I'm not sure exactly how Danny was caught, but he was caught. So since Danny was now on the outs with Cliff, he needed to try and figure out another way to get to him. Just because Danny was caught snooping and ended up costing him whatever it was he had with Cliff and all the access that Danny once had to his home and his assets, he came up with a new plan since that all evaporated. But this time, Kashul was out of jail and he would be having a starring role in the next con. Kashul was front and center this time around when they decided on Plan B. And Plan B is pretty much what happened to Cliff. They came up with some sort of wacky kidnapping and extortion plot. This is what they did. About 3 weeks after Cliff caught Danny snooping on his things, Cliff received an interesting and surprising phone call. The gentleman on the other end had a very distinguished British-sounding accent, sort of. British-ish, but also kind of sounded like Indian, like Indian. The caller said, "Hi, Mr. Lambert, this is Samuel Oren calling you. This is regarding the inheritance you're making from the May Trust." And May is the last name of the benefactor that he's referencing. And that would be Florine May. She was a close friend of Cliff's. She was a very wealthy woman with a penthouse apartment in New York, and she apparently had a vast collection of very expensive paintings, masterpieces apparently, in her home. Dateline showed a short montage of several of the artworks that Cliff had taken pictures of himself next to. So this alleged British attorney, Samuel Oren, had some superbly outstanding news for him. Miss Florine May left him a collection of artwork worth hundreds of millions of dollars, including some Picassos even. Millions and millions of dollars that these paintings were worth, and Cliff has come to find that he's inheriting all of them. Here's the thing though. You know that old adage, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is? Well, this is one of those times. It was indeed too good to be true. But Cliff never really questioned what he was being told by this British attorney. And if inheriting a collection of priceless artworks is too good to be true, then somebody's lying to Cliff. And that somebody, this British guy, yeah, he's too good to be true too. That was Kashul Nurullah all along, posing as an attorney, telling Cliff the biggest lie in order to try to pull off their next heist. Even though Danny was no longer in Cliff's good graces and no longer welcome in Cliff's home, he had spent enough time and enough chit-chatty conversations with Cliff to be able to come up with this ruse that was believable. Cliff, it seems, didn't just share, he overshared with the people that were close to him, which is part of the reason why he ended up in the situation he ended up in, most likely, letting too many people too close to his inner circle, you know? So, of course, Cliff gets this phone call about this great news, and he has to spill this all to his friend Eddie. It was about a week before Cliff went missing, towards the end of November of 2008, when Eddie received a phone call from Cliff telling him about this terrific news of this windfall of artwork. He said that Florine May's British attorneys have contacted him to let him know he was named in the will, and this was apparently a new will which negated all others. So, a little background on this. Florine May Schoenborn originally hailed from Denver, Colorado, and she came from Old Money. Born February 17th, 1903, she and her family eventually moved to New York. Florine was married 3 times in her life. The first time she wed Martin Strauss, a wedding that took place on May 19th, 1921, when Florine was only 18 years old. That marriage was short-lived and ended in divorce. Florine then met and went on to marry Samuel Marks on April 5th, 1937, and she would stay married to him until his death in 1964. Throughout their relationship, Florine and Samuel amassed a collection of some of the world's most exquisite pieces of artwork. They were well known in the art collector community as their personal collection was one of the most extensive and distinguished to be owned by a private individual or individuals as opposed to being the property of a museum. After Samuel passed away, Florine met and subsequently married a 3rd time to Wolfgang Schoenborn, and she stayed married to him until he passed in 1986. Florine herself lived to be 93 years old. She died in 1995. And when she did finally pass away, she bequeathed most of her collection of artwork that she and her second husband collected together to the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art. So, knowing what you know about Cliff's past, of course, Cliff became acquainted with Florine through the art world and during the time that Cliff resided in New York. They became fast friends, and with Cliff even referring to Florine as a surrogate mother of sorts. So when she did pass away in 1995, Cliff fully expected to be bequeathed at least one of her multi-million-dollar pieces of artwork, but it was not to be. In her will, Florine left Cliff exactly nothing, and it was hugely disappointing for Cliff. And that was kind of the thing with him. Throughout his life, it seemed like when it came to rubbing elbows with the wealthy and the famous, Cliff could mostly hold his own, but he kind of just sort of got by. Nothing spectacular had ever happened to him. He never had that kind of luck. But now he's getting this phone call about this inheritance, and for once, someone was actually coming through for him. And he was thrilled about it. It had been 13 years since Florine died when this supposed new will surfaced somewhere in London that she had left some pieces of artwork to Cliff worth millions. The totality of her collection was said to be worth upwards of $200 million. Even with all the strange things that happened to Cliff over the course of the 8 months that he was hanging out with Danny, he did not seem to think that this was yet another trick to get over on him. He believed what he was being told, probably because he really, really, really wanted to believe it. So, Cashul, posing as that attorney, let Cliff know that they were finalizing the transfer of the artwork. It was supposedly about to be given to the Met, but since the surfacing of this new will became a thing, they wanted to nail down an exact time to meet up with Cliff in order to complete the transfer. And even though we're sitting here thinking that we wouldn't have bought this story hook, line, and sinker if this was said to us, nobody really smelled a rat. Not Cliff, not his friend Eddie. Nobody was really suspicious of anything. As far as Eddie was concerned, this is exactly the way Cliff was. This was the way he lived his life. Crazy things happened to Cliff all the time, but really never anything like this. So it isn't out of the realm of possibility that, hey, finally, Cliff is on the come up in life for once. Legitimately. So Cashul, posing as that attorney, called once again. Before he was allegedly about to get on this flight from New York to Southern California in order to exchange the artwork. Yeah, this guy's gonna fly across the country with hundreds and millions of dollars in artwork just to hand it over to Cliff in Palm Springs and be like, okay, cool, check you later. Kashul confirmed with Cliff that he would be at his house by 5:30 p.m. sharp. The guy was adamant about the time being precise. Cliff shared the excitement with Eddie, but this time, Eddie was a little put off by the fact that the guy was coming to Cliff's house. He suggested that it might be wise to meet up in a public place, and Cliff did agree that was probably a better idea. So, on December 4th, 2008, Cliff and this British attorney met up at a place called Dink's. Not only was Cliff excited about acquiring these pieces of artwork, it turned out the British attorney was somewhat of a looker himself. He was successful and handsome, and he seemed to be interested in Cliff. So yeah, Kashul was really swinging for the fences with this latest con that he and Danny cooked up. And this was a con that Dennis, the cousin, Danny's cousin, he was in on it too. So he was able to provide details that we might not have otherwise known. But I don't know. I'm a little suspicious of the version that Dennis recounted on Dateline to Josh Mankiewicz, and I'll explain. Dennis claimed that Kashul hired two guys to be the muscle, and that it was their job to sneak into Cliff's garage while they were out to dinner. And when they returned home, these two guys were to jump out from the shadows and snatch up Cliff, kidnap him, and take him across the border into Mexico. The plan was to hold him hostage there for several months while they took their sweet time looting Cliff's home and bank accounts. And according to Dennis, he knew this to be fact because he said he and Danny were there too, outside Cliff's house, sitting in a car together as lookouts. Now, the only reason why I can only take this story with a grain of salt is because I do not trust anything that Dennis Dominy has to say. I don't think Kashul and Danny would really bring 4 other men along with them. I think Dennis could have quite possibly made up the whole story in order to cover up his own involvement, and he can't even really admit to this having been a murder plot from the beginning, not a kidnapping plot, because if Dennis and Danny were actually the ones who were hiding in the garage, which is what I suspect, then that would seriously implicate Dennis in the crime, especially since a murder ended up taking place. It may or may not have been the initial plan, the whole kidnapping thing. Those are charges that Dennis is not wanting to be around. He's wanting to avoid this. He wants to distance himself. But I really don't think that there were 2 additional hired guys that were meant to be the muscle. The likely story is that it was actually Dennis and Danny who were hiding in the garage, waiting to jump on Cliff when he arrived home. I mean, it's a quiet December evening in Palm Springs. What all is there to look out for, really? I don't know what the truth is, but Dennis is doing a pretty good job not getting himself locked up, but still being able to get in front of the camera and insert himself into the story. So in his telling of the story, not only does Dennis manage to sidestep anything that could implicate him in the crimes, at the same time, he's actually portraying himself out to be the unsung hero of it all. He claimed that as he sat outside in the car with Danny, his own personal moral compass started wanting to be on the right track, pointing him into the more sound decision, into doing the right thing, which meant not being involved in doing this. He said that he knew something bad was going to happen, and he just came to the conclusion that he would not just sit there while these guys do whatever they think they're about to do to Cliff. If they wanted to do this, then they're going to have to do it without him. So Dennis claimed that he started blasting music and laying on the horn and flashing his high beams, all in an attempt to draw Kashul back out of the house. And that's exactly what ended up happening, according to Dennis. Kashul and the 2 hired men left the scene in the middle of this meeting with Cliff due to the disruptions that Dennis was causing outside. So what he's saying is he tried to shut down the whole entire kidnapping plan by causing a ruckus. That was the first attempt, according to Dennis, that they made to carry out the kidnapping. When Dennis allegedly started causing a scene outside, it prompted Kashul and the supposed other 2 men to quickly make their way out of the house and abort their plan. So as they left, Dennis said that he told Danny to count him out of any future kidnapping and extortion plots. He wanted nothing more to do with it, and he claimed to go back to Northern California, and that's his story, and he's sticking to it. The night of the kidnapping actually happened the next night. He was in Sacramento, hundreds of miles away the whole time, and had nothing to do with it. It was only one day later that they supposedly went back to the job, and Dennis got word that Cliff had been kidnapped and the scheme to rip him off was underway. He was hearing this after the fact. Dennis claimed, as far as he knew, they were holding Cliff hostage in Mexico, and that was kind of the same story that the bartender that I told you about in part 1, Miguel Bustamante, provided to investigators. Remember, he was the guy that showed up at Cliff's house with the U-Haul truck and instructions to pick up some pieces of artwork. So the person investigators are interested in possibly using as the snitch or the informant is none other than Miguel Bustamante himself. As a reminder, he is a 25-year-old, a very good-looking guy. I don't think he's gay. And he's in there. He was picked up for questioning when he had that U-Haul and arrested for burglary and I think possession of stolen goods or something like that. He's been sitting in the jail. He's under arrest, but he's telling people in there that he's under arrest for murder, when the truth was he was in there because he had a U-Haul trying to steal artwork from an older man. As it turned out, another inmate who investigators have used as an informant in the past was in a cell with Miguel when Miguel began telling the guy what he was arrested for, that he confessed to killing a rich guy and burying him out in the desert. That's the story Miguel was telling other inmates in prison. Miguel even drew this jailhouse informant a map of where the body was buried, the manner in which he stabbed Cliff, told him everything, every detail start to finish. So in order to kind of get Miguel concerned about the way in which he said that he disposed of Cliff's body, that jailhouse informant told Miguel that they're going to find Cliff's body sooner or later if he didn't bury him deep enough. Those bodies always seem to make their way to the surface eventually, only to be found by a random hiker or something of the sort. The informant offered to get some of his boys on the outside to move the body to a different location, and that's how this informant got Miguel to draw him the map. He also got Miguel to make a list of all the people involved in the case and what their roles were. There was David Replogle, the attorney who pretended to be the broker, I guess, of the exchange of the artwork. There was Danny Garcia, the online date. There was Kashul Narula. He plays, I guess, the eccentric, wealthy foreign prince. So he mapped out all of these people along with the map of the location of Cliff's remains, supposedly. But at the bottom of the piece of paper that Miguel wrote all of the stuff down on, there was a name that nobody had heard about, and that name was Ricky McCain. We'll sort out who that was in a little bit. So by February of 2009, investigators believed Cliff Lambert to be deceased. They believed he was murdered inside his own home and that he was a victim of some very elaborate scheme to plunder his money. They also have a short list of people connected to this case that the investigators really wanted to know more about. Kashul the Prince, Danny the date, David the lawyer, Miguel the bartender, and now this Ricky McCain person. Who was Ricky McCain? That was a name that had not surfaced through the course of the investigation, so they needed to try and figure out who this Ricky person was and how he fit into all of this. But the first order of business was to get Prince Kashul and attorney David into custody to face charges related to them trying to sell Cliff's house. And they were pretty easy to track down and to take into custody because the day that they were both arrested, they both were at a hearing inside of a San Francisco courthouse stemming from the jewelry heist case that Kashul was involved in earlier in 2008. David was his criminal defense attorney. Because remember, I had mentioned that Kashul had spent most of 2008 fighting those charges from inside the county jail. So after that hearing in the courthouse, both the prince and the attorney were arrested. David Replogel's involvement was pretty much locked into a single thumbprint. His thumbprint was the one in which he used when he forged Cliff's name on legal documents and had them notarized. So yeah, for now, both Kashul and Replogel are going to cool off in jail on fraud charges while investigators continue to work on Cliff's case. David Replogel tried denying that he had anything to do with what happened to Cliff, that he had no knowledge of any sort of scheme to steal Cliff's home and all of its contents, and it was very much hanging over his head the fact that the fraud was the least of his criminal charges problems. He was looking at first-degree murder charges with special circumstances for financial gain and possibly crimes against the elderly. I don't know if that's on the books here in California. I'm not in California, but there in California. But here in Nevada, there was a special circumstance in a case that was pretty high profile. If you remember, former Clark County Public Administrator Robert Tellis was convicted of having killed someone over the age of 60. That was kind of woven into the charges. It's like what's it called? An aggravating. God, what is wrong with me today? I'm just like having brain farts. Yes, killing somebody over the age of 60 in Nevada is an aggravating circumstance if you wake up one day and decide to murder someone elderly. 60 sounds kind of young to be calling them elderly, huh? I'm only saying that now because I'm 51. Anyway, so the two of them, Kashul and Replogel, were questioned, which was video and audio recorded, but I only saw a couple of short clips. David Replogel had already been implicated in the crime by way of his fingerprint when he forged Cliff's name in the notary book. So when his first strategy was going to be to deny knowledge of anything untoward going on, that fingerprint just kind of sort of messed that all up for him. But once the detectives let it be known that he was looking at some charges way more serious than a little bit of fraud here and there, Replogel decided to come up with a different story, and it was almost like he had this story at the ready, like he knew this was coming. David Replogel admitted that Cliff Lambert was indeed dead, but insisted there was no murder involved. He denied knowing any of the specifics of what actually happened, but he apparently heard that there was some sort of unspecified accident or that somebody did something to him. But yeah, he confirmed that Cliff was indeed deceased. The detective asked him to clarify who these people that he was referring to as they were, and Replogel named Miguel Bustamante and Kashul Narula. From there, the questioning jumped to Kashul. They took the handcuffs off and they sat him down, and he looks like a preppy little prick. And when they asked him how he was doing, he didn't really answer. He tried to play it off like he had no idea why he was being brought in for questioning. And the detective was like, "Well, would you like to know?" And he was like, "Yes." I think you've probably already guessed by now that Kashul isn't any kind of royalty from anywhere. He just called himself Prince, and that was all the coronation ceremony he needed, apparently. As the detective sat down with Kashul to question him about Cliff and all of this nonsense going on, he denied involvement. He was asked how his attorney, Replogel, was in possession of Cliff's driver's license, and he said that he had no clue. David had used Cliff's stolen driver's license to have those documents fraudulently notarized. Beyond that, as the detective was talking to Kashul, he began to realize that his voice sounded familiar, and he quickly realized that Kashul had left a voicemail on Cliff's answering machine at his house, and during the search of the home, they listened to his messages, and sure enough, Kashul had left Cliff a voicemail claiming to be a person named Samuel Oren, He had a distinctive accent, and the way that he talked, it was pretty obvious that Cashel was the same person that was calling himself Samuel Oren on Cliff Lambert's very own answering machine. So what we have here is Cashel Narula pretending to be Samuel Oren, who was pretending to be an attorney, who was in charge of having artwork that he was pretending was going to be delivered to Cliff, artwork that he was told that he had inherited from his old friend Florine May. Cashel was this attorney out of New York with this inheritance worth millions. Cliff was thinking, he seems legitimate. I'm just going to believe what he's saying. Hook, line, and sinker. So Detective Browning asked Cashel about the voicemails that he had left on Cliff's machine. And he told him flat out, you are the one who left those messages on Cliff's answering machine. And he also told him straight away, that's where you screwed up. And you could tell in watching the clips of the questioning that the detective had Cashel on the ropes. He told him, I heard your voice in the messages. You want to continue denying? But the detective was like, look, I know it's you. Stop lying to me. You're only making this worse. From there, Cashel tried to blame his attorney, David Replogle, for telling Cliff when they met that Cashel was an attorney. And he just kind of sort of went along with the story. And the detective could tell that this wasn't Cashel's first rodeo. He seemed quite used to and comfortable with talking to law enforcement and knew exactly how to duck and dodge and bob and weave around the questions. And Cashel denied any involvement except for having some paperwork that Cliff was supposed to sign that Replogle had prepared. Cashel was just a middle person to meet with Cliff, and that it was actually David Replogle who was in charge of the whole entire exchange of the artwork transaction that was supposed to have taken place. So Cashel was told. So here, Cashel is trying to act like he was also duped. Like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I was completely fooled. Yeah, bullshit. Unfortunately for Cashel, the detective who was peppering him with questions laced with accusations, they already were well aware of Cashel's involvement in the case of the missing Cliff Lambert. They were fairly certain that he was dead, and he was going to let Cashel know what was going to happen next moving forward. That they knew that he was the last person to see Cliff, so that he, Cashel, was headed to jail, and that they were going to the district attorney's office to file murder charges against him. Acting shocked at the notion that he's implicated in some kind of murder scheme, Cashel gasped, "Excuse me?" Yeah, so in a unique twist that I don't think I've seen before, Cashel was already being represented. Even at the time he was actually put into handcuffs and taken into custody, the same thing was actually happening to his attorney. And so there goes his representation, I guess. I don't know. It's very different. We've never seen anything like that before. Well, anyway, at the very least, Cashel already had a criminal defense attorney at the ready since they had just been in court for that jewelry heist case. And they were both going to county jail now, apparently. So I guess Cashel's going to have to find another attorney somewhere else. Maybe that's a conflict of interest, I suppose. Well, after Cashel got taken in and booked, he made his phone call, which was recorded. And it wasn't to David Replogle, obviously. Most likely because they're probably neighbors in the county jail at the moment. It was none other than Danny Garcia, the guy where all of this started. And I'm sorry if I'm starting to sound redundant, but there are so many people in this story, and I like to try to keep them straight and to remind ourselves of who they are as we go along, because I get mixed up when there's a conspiracy amongst a group of individuals. So Danny, he was the date. He was the one that befriended Cliff. He was the one where all of this entire whole convoluted mess had started. That's the phone call that Cashel had to make. He wasn't trying to waste any time. He asked Danny where he was at. Danny said he was at his apartment. Cashel gave him a one-word order: go. And Danny heeded the warning and did try to abscond. Except he decided to bring his phone with him, and they traced him by his location. And this was 2009, right? pretty early on for being able to ping a phone that precisely. The thing was, in 2009, not everybody had an iPhone yet. They were on the iPhone 3s at the time, and these guys, this band of misfits that we've been talking about, they were pretty savvy with the technology and stuff. And they had the newest devices available at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, the prosecutor on the case, DeMaria, she did say at one point that this was the first case where they needed to do a forensic examination on an iPhone. Nobody in the department had even ever used or investigated an iPhone at that point. So they were learning as they were going along. And as I had said, they managed to track down Danny by pinging his location. They found him hiding in a home in Sacramento. He was in a closet along with a stockpile of electronics, laptops, hard drives, cell phones. So much to examine. It was going to be daunting. But they needed everything that they could get their hands on because the one thing they didn't have was Cliff himself. They did not have a body. And Prosecutor DeMaria, she wasn't about to sit around and wait for investigators to try and find where Cliff was or what they did with him. She was going to move forward with a no-body case against the 4 main players in this conspiracy: Danny Garcia, Kashul Narula, David Replogle, and Miguel Bustamante. So that brings us up to this next question. What about Ricky McCain? Remember I mentioned another person who had been thrown into the ring by Miguel Bustamante during his interrogation? I just mentioned it a few minutes ago. There was still a matter of trying to figure out who he was. The investigation into who he was turned up nothing. There didn't seem to be anybody by that name linked to any of these guys, but the detectives still weren't ready to give up just yet. And after being on this case for about 6 months, investigators found out through Bustamante's girlfriend that they had shared an apartment with another person, a roommate, and his name was Craig McCarthy. And the mention of that name caused Prosecutor DeMaria to have like a light bulb moment. And McCain, she kind of associated the MCC name, McCarthy. That's who they wanted to track down. She thinks that, or she put it together that Ricky McCain was in fact Craig McCarthy. He had been discharged from the military. He was living in San Francisco, where he was working and attending college. He had no criminal record to speak of, so he was brought in for questioning. And when he was asked about what he was up to in Palm Springs, he said that his roommate, Miguel, asked him if he wanted to take a quick trip down to Palm Springs with him in December of 2008, and that it was just him and Miguel. And the only reason he agreed to go was because Miguel Bustamante said that he'd cover all the expenses, food, gas, a place to stay, etc. So he agreed to go. The story Miguel told him was they were basically going to hang out and relax, but also help out a friend, but mostly a fun road trip. And then they just inexplicably wound up at Cliff's house. This is McCarthy's story, Craig McCarthy. This is what he's telling investigators. So according to Craig, he said that they, Miguel Bustamante, Kashul Narula, and Craig McCarthy himself, were standing in the kitchen of Cliff's house when none other than Cliff himself appeared, and everyone was taken aback. The 3 of them were not invited guests. They were intruders at that point. They were not expecting Cliff to be home. They were just as surprised, apparently, as Cliff was. At that point, Craig said he heard Cliff exclaim, "What are you doing here? What the hell is going on?" And that is when Cliff's disappearance began. By the time this questioning was happening with Craig McCarthy, it was the middle of summer, July of 2009, a little more than 6 months after Cliff went missing. They asked Craig McCarthy to accompany the investigators to Cliff's house and show them exactly who and where everything went down, to which Craig agreed. There was an access gate leading to Cliff's driveway and into his house. According to Craig, they climbed the gate to get in and let themselves into the house, and from there, he spilled the beans and all of it was recorded. The night before Cliff disappeared, according to Craig, they were there supposedly to gain access to Cliff's garage. And in the video, you can see Cliff's Rolls-Royce parked there next to a Mercedes-Benz, if I'm not mistaken. I just looked at crime scene pictures, and it looked like it was a Mercedes. He said that the plan was for Kishul to take Cliff out for dinner for a meeting about the inheritance of the artwork from his old friend who had died some years earlier. When he and Kishul returned from Cliff's home, he and Miguel were supposed to be hiding in the garage, so I guess that part of the story was somewhat true. I don't know how Danny and Dennis worked themselves into the story. Maybe they were lookouts, but I definitely do not think that Danny interrupted the whole thing by blaring his horn and blasting his music. I don't think that happened, but maybe they did hire these two guys. They weren't even two guys that it was they're friends. These are friends of Kishul and Danny. This bartender, Miguel, and his roommate, they're all acquaintances. They don't necessarily have to be hired. They could just be giving them a little bit off the top, you know? Dennis made it sound like they had gone and hired like some professional muscle. I would hardly call these guys professional anythings. And the story that Craig is going to tell might be also him minimizing what happened, but it kind of falls in line with Miguel's story that none of this happened on the night of December 4th. It actually all went down on December 5th. So, like I said, this questioning was going on in July of 2009. They asked Craig to go to Cliff's house and show them exactly how, where, who, and everything that happened, how it went down at the actual scene. And Craig agreed to do so. There was an access gate leading to Cliff's driveway and into his house. According to Craig, they climbed the gate to get in and let themselves into the house. And from there, he explained what happened. At least according to him. So the night before Cliff disappeared, they were supposed to be inside Cliff's garage. And in the garage is the Rolls-Royce and the Mercedes-Benz. And he said the plan was for Kishul to take Cliff out to dinner for a meeting about the inheritance of the artwork from his old friend that had died some years earlier. When he and Kishul returned to Cliff's home, Craig said he and Miguel were supposed to be hiding in the garage when they pulled in and they were to attack Cliff. However, according to Craig, he said as he sat there in the garage, he got cold feet. In fact, according to him, both he and Miguel Bustamante lost their nerve. They did not want to do this. There was one detail that Craig's story did not corroborate, and that was the story that Dennis Domine gave about being parked outside Cliff's house with his cousin Danny Garcia. And that he was the one who didn't want to go through with this, so he started flashing his headlights and playing loud music from his car stereo in order to draw attention and cause Kishul and Miguel and apparently Craig to panic and call off the plan. But he said that they decided to come back the next night to finish what they had started, and the plan all along was to kill Cliff. They never had a plan to just rob him or kidnap him and to keep him as a hostage in Mexico while they burglarize him in his home. And they were actually kind of lucky, to get a second opportunity to do this to Cliff. If they flaked out on the first meeting and Cliff was like, okay, well, I'll go ahead and agree to a second meeting, that just goes to show that either he was kind of gullible or he really, really, really believed in this and wanted to get his hands on those pieces of artwork that were supposedly left to him. He just couldn't resist. Kishul Narula, he was still pretending to be Sam Oren, attorney at law. He was able to talk Cliff into moving forward with the signing of the documents to secure his inheritance on the following night. And I am pretty sure that it was a collection of artwork that Cliff thought he was getting, not just one piece of artwork. I think Cliff was expecting several pieces worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was too good to be true, but it was also too good for Cliff to pass up. While Kishul was inside finalizing the deal with Cliff, Craig said he and Miguel were standing on the other side of the door that led to the exterior of Cliff's house. While Kishul and Cliff were talking inside, they were having drinks and smoking a couple of cigarettes. And you remember the Benson and Hedges that Cliff's good friend Eddie happened to notice when he went looking for Cliff when he failed to show up for that December 5th Festival of Lights parade that they had planned to go to together. The cue for Craig and Miguel was to wait for Kashul to announce that he needed to use the restroom. So he got up from where he was seated with Cliff, and it was at that point Miguel and Craig quietly let themselves into Cliff's house. They tiptoed into the kitchen where they each grabbed a knife from the cutlery block on the counter. And with Detective Browning posing as Cliff in Cliff's actual kitchen, Craig McCarthy demonstrated how he grabbed Cliff when he made his way into the kitchen and held his own kitchen knife to Cliff's throat. He said that Cliff was repeatedly asking what they wanted. He said Miguel was kind of standing in front of the both of them, facing them as he held Cliff there. And as Cliff was asking what they wanted, Craig said Miguel told him that he knew what this was about. Craig said he was kind of just standing there, looking back and forth between Cliff and Miguel until Miguel told him to move. So Craig kind of turned Cliff to the side and stepped back. And from there, he said Miguel began attacking Cliff with the knife that he had. Craig said that Miguel started attacking him from behind, that he stabbed Cliff in the back of the neck or the upper back, literally backstabbing, right? Craig described Cliff as he grabbed the back of his neck and he doubled over and began moaning in pain. He then said as Cliff was leaned over, Miguel grabbed a second knife and was basically double fisting with a knife in each hand, stabbing Cliff in the back, alternating between the knife in his right hand and the knife in his left hand. Cliff bent over, maybe hunched on the ground, while Miguel was stabbing him over and over in the back with two knives. Now, I don't know if I necessarily believe Craig's version of the story here, which takes both murder weapons and places them into the hands of only one killer, and if Craig McCarthy is just trying to minimize his role in Cliff's murder, or if the truth is that they both stabbed Cliff in the back, which is why he was stabbed with two different knives, and Craig here is attempting to remove himself from this part of the narrative. It is unusual for one attacker to be holding two weapons, unless you're a teenage mutant ninja turtle or some kind of samurai and you have a weapon in each hand. That's the only time I see people really with like dual weapons. So anyway, Craig is standing in the kitchen on this video recounting the story, claiming to have just been standing there looking on as Miguel stabbed Cliff over and over again. I guess when Miguel was satisfied that Cliff was dead, or the both of them suspected that Cliff was dead, as I suspect that they were both involved in a stabbing, they then took Cliff's body and placed it into the trunk of his own Mercedes, and from there drove him out to the desert where they buried him in a shallow grave. With this new information, crime scene analysts were brought to Cliff's house, but by then it had been cleaned up so well that there was really no sign that a violent, bloody event had taken place there. And while the detectives were satisfied with Craig's story and how he fully implicated Kashul Nerula and Miguel Bustamante, there was still the matter of Danny Garcia. Danny claimed to have not been in the vicinity of Cliff's house at all the night that Cliff was murdered. And Craig's version of the story corroborated that, and he was, in fact, not there. Turns out he was in Northern California. But his cell phone is what would end up implicating him in the whole conspiracy. He may not have been involved in the actual murder of Cliff Lambert, but his hands were just as bloodied as everyone else's in this whole entire story. In fact, according to Dateline, this was the first time, at least for this investigative agency, that the text messages were downloaded as a part of the collection of evidence in an actual homicide case. First time that this department ever downloaded text messages was this case. The switching over from flip phones to smartphones was a brand new thing at the time. 2008 going into 2009, and I didn't get an iPhone until I believe 2011. And my cell carrier, which was Sprint at the time, didn't even offer the iPhone. I think it was still exclusive to AT&T, but these guys, in addition to being a group of grifters and conmen, they also enjoyed having the latest in electronics and technology, and they all used iPhones in their planning and plotting. It was the first time the prosecutor had a case that involved iPhones, and they were on the first generation of the iPhone 3. The police department was not equipped with the know-how at the time to process the forensic analysis of the phones, so what they ended up doing was hiring a professional hacker that was able to break into the iPhones that belonged to these guys. So when that hacker got into Danny Garcia's phone, they discovered tens of thousands of text messages, none of which had been deleted. All of them were right there, and as the task of going through them was daunting, it did reveal many messages that discussed Cliff Lambert, his home, where he lived, and the information regarding his financials and his banking. They even called their scheme Operation CL for Cliff Lambert. As they went through the massive amount of text messages, they discovered that these guys, they were under the impression that Cliff was worth upwards of nearly $70 million. And while there was never any direct talk about killing Cliff or getting rid of him in any of these messages, when you line it all up, it created a very intricate mosaic outlining their nefarious plan to murder Cliff and to take him for all he's worth. There was one single text message that hinted at murder. It was the night that Cliff was killed. It was sent from Cashul to Miguel Bustamante, and it said, "Do it now, stab with a knife." There was another one from Danny Garcia to Cashul just after Cliff was killed, and it asked if he cleaned up the Benson and Hedges. Remember those cigarettes that Eddie saw on Cliff's dining or coffee table? He was the first one to mention the Benson and Hedges, and it came up again. Cliff was not a smoker, so it had stood out to Eddie that there were cigarette butts in the ashtray, and he just happened to note the brand. It was sort of just like dumb luck that Eddie made note of the brand of cigarettes that he saw, as that was the detail that solidly linked Cashul to the scene of the murder, that Cashul had really been inside Cliff's house. The prosecutor, she had really kind of put this together based on the manner and the tone of all the text messages that were found. This group of guys really thought that they were going to pull off some sort of Ocean's 11 style crime, and that they were enjoying what they were doing, that this was fun for them, this game that they were playing with Cliff Lambert's life and his money. Since they loved the excitement and the drama, they were going to have plenty of that to go around, as each of them were going to be made to answer to these crimes in a court of law, and they intended to continue to play those games as best they could with the justice system as well. Prosecutor Lisa DeMaria was the one who was going to see each of these cases through the court system start to finish. And they were going to give her a run for her money too. She described the whole ordeal as if she were Alice in Wonderland and had fallen into some crazy rabbit hole. Lisa DeMaria's entire life was consumed by this case for months and years on end. And of course, these guys are so arrogant and so stupid at the same time, so much so that Danny Garcia and Cashul Narula decided to act as their own attorneys. That's how dumb these guys are. And their way of messing with the whole system was to file pretrial motion after pretrial motion after pretrial motion. They were costing the county tens of thousands of dollars. 9 different court-appointed attorneys came and went prior to them going pro se, along with 128 pre-trial hearings before this case even went to trial. 2 years and nearly 130 trips to court for all the motions that these guys were filing. It was a mockery. They were making a mockery of the justice system, but apparently it was their right to do so. They've got nothing but time on their hands, and this was all fun and games for them. But DeMaria wasn't worried about her case. She was certain that she had what she needed to win convictions across the board, with or without Cliff's body. Craig McCarthy, a young man who served this country, he made it out of the Marines and was living and working, going to school, trying to better his life, threw all of that away for these guys. Because of his confession, he was given a plea deal where he would be sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The first two to go on trial would be tried together, the attorney, David Replogle, and the bartender turned killer, Miguel Bustamante. And they were both pretty easily convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The damning evidence against Replogle was the fact that he put his thumbprint in the logbook of the notary when he posed as Cliff when he was trying to sell his house and his belongings. Miguel had been implicated by Craig McCarthy, who testified against him at his trial as a part of his plea. And while Prosecutor DeMaria was confident in her cases against Bustamante and Replogle, she knew that they weren't as quick with the smooth talk and the fast thinking as Kashul Narula and Danny Garcia were. So she was a little more concerned about them and if they'd be able to pull the wool over the eyes of the jury, considering she did not have Cliff Lambert's body. It would only take one juror to have just enough reasonable doubt to hang the whole entire case. And it was Kashul and Danny Garcia's plan to try and make the prosecutor out to be the one that has no clue what she's doing. That, according to them, DeMaria is so hell-bent on getting a conviction that she's gone after them for no good reasons, when they were both just innocent associates of Cliff's trying to broker a deal for his benefit. And their way of going about this was to cause a spectacle in the courtroom. Just as the trial was about to start, just as the jury was filing into the courtroom, just as they were about to take their seats at the beginning of this trial, there was one extra person at the end of the jury line, and that person approached Prosecutor Lisa DeMaria and asked her, "Hey, are you Lisa DeMaria?" And she replied that she was, and this person proceeded to serve her with a lawsuit just as she was preparing to deliver her opening statement that morning. The lawsuit was accusing her of prosecutorial misconduct, and she literally had to be questioned by both Danny Garcia and Kashul Narula. She provided testimony defending her work as the prosecutor on the case, and their lawsuit ended up getting tossed out in the end. None of what they claimed was substantiated. It was all for show, and probably to try and knock the prosecutor off balance for a time. Being the fact that nothing like this had ever happened before, a prosecutor having to be cross-examined by the very defendants that she was taking to trial for first-degree murder, it was unheard of. Even after getting over that hurdle, these guys weren't done. Death threats were being made against Lisa DeMaria. She was told by jailhouse informants who overheard the conversation and ended up telling her, "Hey, these guys in here are talking about having a hit put on you." And she did take those threats very seriously, even staying at a hotel in order to hide her location. So that strategy that Danny and Kashul had come up with to try and, I guess, confuse the court, so much so that the judge declared a mistrial, or would declare a mistrial, they were hoping, and get the case tossed out. Remember, they're representing themselves here, so Kashul, when he delivered his opening statement, he bizarrely said that Danny had nothing to do with the murder and that all of those text messages found between himself and Danny were actually planted by the investigators. But remember, investigators had never examined an iPhone before. They certainly weren't going to know how to plant evidence in a device that they never cracked open before in life. But Kashul stood up in the court and said that there was a very plausible explanation for the planting of evidence, that there was a reason for it. When Danny Garcia gave his opening statement, he claimed that the notion that he was the mastermind of a murder conspiracy was a joke, and it was ridiculous to think that he was capable of doing something like this, and that this whole thing is akin to something you would make up in some sort of fictionalized movie. And Kashul insisted that once they got to know him and heard from him in his trial, that the jury, he was talking directly to them, would be able to find him to be a very different person than the one that the prosecutor is trying to make him out to be. And their defense for both Kashul and Danny, their defense was going to be that Cliff Lambert was not dead. He was very much alive, and very much well and breathing and enjoying life on some tropical hideaway. But Prosecutor DeMaria had proof that wasn't the case. Friends had received emails purportedly from Cliff, who was in Hawaii, but she was able to show that it was Danny who created and sent those emails by way of breaking into his email accounts and pretending to be Cliff. DeMaria could see that Cashul and Garcia were hard at work trying to cause the court to grow weary of them, to try to take up the court's time and to cause as much chaos and confusion as they possibly could so that they could somehow cause the prosecutor or someone on her team to make a mistake so egregious enough for the judge to call it a mistrial, that they decided to try to turn this courtroom into a circus. The two defendants, they both tried blaming each other for the whole thing, and then they both strangely blamed themselves for the whole thing, which is where the whole planting of the evidence was brought up. Cashul said that investigators planted everything on Danny's phone. After Cashul made the claim that Danny Garcia had no involvement, when it was his turn to be cross-examined by DeMaria, he refused to take the stand. And when he did that, Danny stood up and made a motion for the court to declare the case a mistrial. And that was followed up by Cashul making the same motion for a mistrial. And while all of this was going on, because Danny was representing himself, the judge allowed him to have a brand new MacBook laptop in order to help him prepare for his case. But instead, Danny, who was considered to be a technological whiz kid, actually used the computer in order to sneakily record conversations within the courtroom. And it is illegal to have recordings in the court, as you well know. Well, he was caught and he was reprimanded, but for whatever reasons, because he has rights, apparently, he was allowed to keep the laptop anyway. Not that people who are facing trial don't have rights, but we all know how this story's going to go. This guy should not have been given anything. But the best evidence that the prosecution had proving Danny's involvement in the conspiracy to murder and rob Cliff Lambert were all the text messages that he had in his phone. Amongst the 33,000 texts, there were thousands of messages with him pretty much directing the whole entire scheme. After all, he was the one who got close to Cliff. He was the one who cased Cliff's house from the inside out and was able to pretty much put together the logistics of the crime. But anyway, their trial lasted 6 months. And after all that everyone had gone through to get to that point, after everything Cashul and Danny tried to pull, it was all for naught because the jury found the both of them guilty of first-degree murder, much to the relief of the prosecutor, who desperately wanted to put this case and all of these guys in her rearview mirror and move on with her life. And so the case is over, right? Not so fast. Danny Garcia still had a card up his sleeve and he intended to play it. It was a big deal and it would be one of the biggest disappointments in Lisa DeMaria's career. I mentioned a moment ago that the judge allowed Danny Garcia to have access to a MacBook since he was representing himself. He had been caught secretly recording conversations in the courtroom, conversations that Danny should not have had any access to at all. But halfway through the trial, Danny was at it again, recording conversations when court was at recess or on a break or whatever. And he managed to capture the private conversation between the judge and his courtroom clerk. And in one of the conversations captured on audio recording by Danny Garcia using that MacBook involved Cashul Narula's filing of so many motions. The judge and his clerk were talking about Cashul's motions, those motions that get delivered in sealed envelopes, I suppose. And well, the clerk was recorded saying this: "He likes licking envelopes." And the judge replied, "Oh, gross, he's HIV positive." And the clerk replied, "He is HIV positive." And the judge replied back, "Yeah, God knows where that tongue has been." Even though Danny Garcia recorded those conversations illegally, it didn't matter how it was obtained. What mattered was the prejudicial nature of the judge's comments and how that could have affected the outcome of the trial. And it wasn't just going to affect Danny Garcia and Kashil Narula's trial. It also impacted the convictions already won by the prosecutor against David Replogle and Danny Bustamante. All 4 convictions were overturned, and the more than 3 years the prosecutor had put into this case, it was all taken away from her. All 4 men would stand trial once again, but Lisa DeMaria would not be the lead prosecutor on the case the second time around, and she could not speak on the reasons for that, so the case was turned over to a new prosecutor who hardly knew anything about the case. His name was Deputy District Attorney Robert Hightower, but even though he didn't know a lot about the case, he was very excited to take it over, thankfully. I don't think Lisa DeMaria wanted to be put through all of that again. If I had to take a guess, she was probably like, nope. Prosecutor Hightower put it in order for the case files to be sent to his office, but a little while later, his paralegal called him up and said, we're going to have to get a separate room for everything that they were about to receive. So all 4 of these guys, Narula, Garcia, Bustamante, and Replogle, they were all back up for retrial. But for this go-round, things were going to be different, very different. The murder of Cliff Lambert was no longer going to be a no-body case. By the time the trials were set to begin in September of 2020, nearly a dozen years since Cliff had disappeared, some of his remains had been found years earlier in a desert area north of Los Angeles. There had been a skull and a jawbone discovered, but were left at the coroner's office for quite some time until they worked to identify who those remains belonged to. Well, in a matter of almost impeccable timing, those bones were eventually identified as belonging to Cliff Lambert. And with that, the whole basis of the defense that Cliff was alive, living it up on a beach in the tropics were gone, making it much, much easier to prosecute, to not have to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to prove that the guy is dead. And remember, Bustamante had drawn a crude map of where Cliff was buried. They had searched to a point that was about a mile or so away from where Cliff was actually found. Eddie was on the road when a friend called him with the news that Cliff's remains had been positively identified. And while having Cliff's skull and jawbone was a big deal, it didn't reveal how Cliff was murdered. And with every defendant this time around pointing the finger at everybody else, the truth would likely remain buried with the rest of Cliff. The first one to stand trial was David Replogle. He'd been in jail for 12 years by then, and the dynamics of the trial could very well change with the passage of time, having to rely on old memories from more than a decade earlier, or even worse, if important witnesses have passed away in the interim. But the one who was there for the first trial and showed up for every single one of the retrials was Cliff's good old friend, Eddie Mullican. He provided nearly identical testimony that he had done so a dozen years earlier. And then the court was hit with a COVID outbreak. This retrial was happening in the fall of 2020, and we were in a full-blown quarantine during this pandemic at the time. Not a lot was going on in the courtroom, and actually, many of us were deeply entrenched in the Lori Vallow case at the time. Chad Daybell, JJ Vallow, Tylee Ryan, Charles Vallow, Alex Cox, Tammy Daybell, and all the others involved in that case. All the while, these retrials were underway while we were chasing down what the heck happened to the kids. Remember, where are the kids? Where are the kids? The whole world's looking for your kids, Lori. That's great, she says. I'll never forget that. It's one of my favorite worst moments. Yeah, while we were consumed with the Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell case, this retrial was happening. And then COVID made its way through the courtroom where Replogle was facing retrial. There were 12 jurors and 10 alternates, and by the time they were finished with the testimony and preparing to give the case over to the jurors, most of them had been dismissed after testing positive for COVID, but they made it. If they had lost one more juror to COVID, then there would have been a mistrial. but they made it, and Replogle was found guilty of first-degree murder for the second time. Miguel Bustamante was the next one to stand trial. Eddie was there again for Cliff. Things were going along swimmingly until the jury was given the case and they went to deliberate. Days and days passed with no word from the jury room. Even though they did take 9 days to deliberate, they did finally deliver a second guilty verdict for the second time against Bustamante. And with that, they're halfway there. Miguel Bustamante and David Replogle were safely back in prison with their life without parole sentences. However, before trial number 3 could get started, there was a stunning turn in the case. Another murder. And that would be the murder of the prince, not prince, Kishul Narula. Kishul, who was 41 years old at the time of his death, was found in his Riverside County jail cell unresponsive early in the afternoon of September 6, 2022. Narula had sustained fatal injuries during an encounter with another inmate. His cellmate, 61-year-old Rodney Sanchez, who was also being held at the jail on whatever charges he was in for, but now was facing an additional charge of murder. According to the Los Angeles Times, this was the 12th death of an inmate held at the Riverside County Jail. Kishul's retrial date had not yet been set. He was due back in court on the Friday of that week that he died. He was killed on Tuesday. And according to the man who killed him, he said he just kind of sort of got sick and tired of listening to Kishul. The guy would just not shut up. He just kept talking and talking and talking. And he just annoyed his cellmate into beating him to death. And, I could very much see that happening to Kishul and his personality. He's so uppity and hoity-toity, like his shit don't stink. He annoyed me every time I heard his voice, so I kind of get it. Don't really like the way the guy sounds. He just sounds fake and disingenuous. And that's exactly what he was. And in a case where Cliff, if he were watching from heaven, might actually be getting the last laugh in all of this. But before we wrap up our story, I have to tell you, there were so many cons and so many lies and so much deceit and so many grifts, so much scheming and wheeling and dealing that we've come to find that at the end of the day, one of the biggest wheelers and dealers of them all, one of the biggest cons, was pulled off by none other than Cliff himself. Cliff Lambert. Danny had taken several pieces of artwork from Cliff's home and transported them to San Francisco with his cousin Dennis Domine. Remember him? The self-proclaimed sociopath who spent a couple stretches in San Quentin for growing weed? Yeah, according to him, when Danny took those paintings, he did so with intentions of selling them and making millions. But before doing so, he took them in to be appraised, and it turned out they were all replicas, worth nothing more than the canvas that they were painted on. Why would Cliff, who apparently boasted all his wealth, with his 5,000 square foot house in Palm Springs and a Rolls Royce and a Mercedes in the garage, why would he have replicas of priceless paintings on the wall? Well, that was all Cliff ever had. That's what he dealt in. Remember, he made his mark in the art world by selling lithographs of famous works of art. The difference was, he told people his paintings were authentic when in fact they were counterfeit and worthless. Cliff Lambert wasn't worth millions when he went missing. Not a millionaire, maybe not even hundreds of thousands there. At the time of his death, Cliff had just under $20,000 in the bank. So yeah, the exaggerated boasting that Cliff Lambert engaged in with these men that he was dating ended up costing him the most real thing that he had, his life. Danny Garcia stood trial, and after his trial, the jury deliberated for less than a day and ultimately found him guilty for a second time as well, of the first-degree murder of Cliff Lambert. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And there was one more conviction, a sixth person involved in this case, though he is not believed to have known about the murder or took part in any way, and that would be a gentleman by the name of Russell Manning. He was a San Francisco art dealer brought into the scheme by David Replogle after he had forged that power of attorney document that was ultimately his downfall with his thumbprint in that notary book. So this Russell Manning. So he was involved in some aspects of the crime, but he said, or he was told, that Cliff was in jail and that he owed money to Cashul, and he helped himself to some of Cliff's assets. He had transferred some of Cliff's money to himself, and he tried to sell Cliff's Palm Springs home. Russell Manning ended up pleading guilty to forgery, grand theft, and burglary, among a few other charges. He had fled to Mexico but was tracked down and brought back to the United States in 2010, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and he has long been out of prison after having served his time. Of the 6, the only ones in prison today are exactly where they deserve to be. Danny Garcia is 43 years old and serving his life without parole sentence in Corcoran State Prison. Miguel Bustamante is also 43 years old and serving his life without at the same place as Danny, Corcoran. David Replogle today is 76 years old and is serving his life sentence without parole at Mule Creek State Prison in Riverside. And Craig McCarthy, he's 46 years old today and is serving his 25-year sentence at the Sierra Conservation Center Fire Camp in Riverside. He is eligible for parole actually later on this year in July of 2026. And that, my dreamers, was the tale of the double cross. What happened to Cliff Lambert? I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it to you. Please don't forget to follow Killafornia Dreaming on Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, all the places. Join, follow, like, comment, and share. Also, if you've got nothing better to do, consider supporting me on Patreon. I've had some new subscribers, and I'm going to go through some of the thank yous. I've just been super bogged down with some other stuff, but I am going to get to you. I'm there for you, and actually, I'm almost done writing your episode. I know it's been a minute, but there's going to be a good one coming up very, very shortly. We're going to go back to the state of Florida and a crime that happened in 2019, not too long ago. So anyway, I want to thank all of you for listening. Thank you for supporting me. Even if you're no longer a patron and you continue to listen to the free show, I appreciate every little bit of support. Every download means everything to me. The fact that you go out of your way to listen every time I put on an episode, still to this day, makes me really want to keep going and going and going until I just can't anymore. But all right, that's all I've got for now. I will be back over on Patreon for a premium episode for those of you who are subscribed. It's coming up very shortly. Thank you again for everything. And as always, take care, be safe, sweet dreams, and don't forget to get your oil changed.